Oh.
You can do that. I don't know what the homeworks are.
Okay. All right, guys, we're gonna get started with lecture for today. So today, this is week 2. We're gonna be learning about CSS selectors and CSS selectors. This is essentially going off of last week's lecture where we talked about HTML, and we'll get into the relationship between HTML and CSS. But before that, let's see this slide. Homework 1 and homework 2 are going to be due next week, not this week, aka today. Next week, the 15th at 6:30, right before lecture. We have both the homework assignments due. I don't know if this mic is like, is it too much? Like, are you guys, because of like, is the mic good? Okay, cool. All right, yeah, those homework assignments are going to be due next week, right before lecture. Lab 1 is going to be due next Monday at 7 p.m. right before lab. And then if you have any questions about homework, if you need help debugging, we're going to have office hours. That's all posted on the ed. Or just email us to make sure, to let us know you're coming to our office hours. Also, if you haven't finished setting up your GitHub yet, please do that ASAP. We have no way to grade your work if you don't submit your GitHub link and set that up properly. So if you need any help and you're already here, feel free to come up to us after lecture if you want some like hands-on debugging. And then reminder that the attendance requirement is still for required in-person lectures throughout the semester. Last week's did count. I did get a few emails about that. So yeah. All right. Before we get started about CSS, on the slideshow, which will be posted on the Notion later after the lecture, this is a little HTML cheat sheet. So these are some important tags that you might be using in your homeworks, your labs, and later on your midterm and your final. I think this is a really good cheat sheet for anyone who's new to HTML and has really never seen it before. It's a good way to keep track of what tags you might be using the most. But you can look more into this later after lecture. Let's just get started. So the main idea of today's lecture is that we usually prefer relative paths to absolute paths. And you might think like, what does this really mean? Well, we'll get into it. So today we're going to learn about CSS, which is basically designing and working with HTML. If we think of HTML as our skeleton or structure of the code, CSS is essentially also code, but we're making that skeleton a little bit prettier and a little bit more user-friendly. So here's a little overview of what we'll be going over today in lecture. So we'll start with files and linking CSS. So how does the HTML file know where to find CSS? We're going to have 2 separate files. The index.html, which we covered last lecture, is essentially what your structure of your website is going to look like. But you also want to have a CSS file that's somewhere in your folder / directory that is linked to your index.html so that it can reference it. So inside your head tag, inside the HTML file, you're going to have something along this line. It's a little link tag, and you're going to have rel equals style sheet, type equals text / CSS, and then your href is whatever your file path is. So you might think this is a little bit much and confusing at first, especially if you've never seen this before, but there's no need to memorize this. You're going to be able to copy and paste this basically like throughout homeworks and labs, and by the second, third time, you're going to memorize it because this doesn't really change much. So usually just to stay organized, you have a folder called assets. And in there you have these image, scripts, and then styles. And then in the styles folder, you want to put your style.css. And you might ask, why do we have a styles folder and not just one style like CSS file? Well, sometimes we're going to have a larger website or project that might have multiple CSS files. And that's why we have the styles folder. All right, let's get into some CSS syntax. So this is essentially what a very common rule in CSS will look like. So the H1 is referencing an HTML element. So H1 and HTML references essentially like header 1. And inside these curly braces, we have what we call CSS properties linked to a property value. And each rule is kind of separated by a semicolon. Getting more into that, on the right-hand side in the CSS file, we have a div selector, which tells what elements in HTML to select or apply these properties to. And the properties that we're applying to the div element is going to be a font size of 32 pixels and then the color green. So font size and color will be the properties, and then 32 pixels and green will be the values. And together we call this a declaration CSS or a rule. Some more nitpicky things is that you're gonna have curly braces in between each property attribute pair, and then each role will be separated by a semicolon. Furthermore, if you want to add comments to your CSS file, this is not going to be read necessarily by the code itself. It's not going to be translated onto your website, but it's more for your own sake when you're coding and you want to say, oh, this is a rule for my homepage. This is a rule for like my connect with me page, you know. It's more for your own sake, or if you're working with other people so that they know what the rule is referencing. So now let's connect HTML and CSS together. On the left-hand side, we have our index.html file. And then on the right-hand side is something new to you guys, style.css file. So like we kind of went over originally in the slides, we're gonna link our style.css file to our HTML file in our header using this link tag. And now this is where the styling comes into play. So in our CSS file, we had a div selector with a property of width 200 pixels, background of beige, and then the color dark blue. So that's referring to in our HTML file, anything that is inside of this div. So we have an H1 and P tag as well, but because these are inside of our div, the CSS selects saying, hey, welcome to WDD and let's learn CSS. This is all gonna have a background of beige, the color is gonna be dark blue, and then the width is gonna be 200 pixels. Now getting a little bit more specific, now we wanna change, let's say, welcome to WDD to a font size of 32 pixels with font Arial. We're gonna choose the H1 tag after our div rule that we set, and we're gonna have those properties and values. Now I'm gonna pass it off to Monica to talk about CSS selectors.
Okay, hi you guys. We're gonna talk about CSS selectors. Okay, so you may be asking yourself, what if you don't want all the tags to be the same style? So if you wanted a paragraph with green text or a paragraph with blue text, you don't want to just refer. If you did P, it wouldn't do color green, color blue, that wouldn't work. So this is why we introduce classes. So classes apply a set of rules to multiple elements on the page. So if you wanted green text for one paragraph, you're gonna say in the first opening tag, you're gonna say class equals green. And you can really name the class anything. You guys can hear me, right? There we go. Sorry. You can name the class anything. You usually want to name it something similar to like the properties of that class or what makes that class unique. And you can include that in any tags, so paragraph tags, header tags, div tags. And then in your CSS file, you're gonna do the HTML element .green. So to refer to any class, you have to put a period and then the notes. And then you can do the properties and values like usual. And then for ID, we also have something called an ID. So this applies to a set of rules. This applies a set of rules to only one distinct element on the page. So if you wanted to make something really unique, this is when you would bring in an ID. And if you wanted only one blue paragraph, you could say ID equals blue. And instead of doing a period, you would do a hashtag in front of the ID name. So hashtag blue, and then the property and the value. And then here we see a bunch of different examples. So you may be wondering, why do we have classes and why do we have IDs when they essentially do the same thing? And this is because they have different priorities. So if you have IDs have priorities over classes, classes have priorities over tags. So if you had an element that was part of the green class, but also had the ID blue, this text element right here, sorry, I'm messing up the microphone. But this text element right here would have blue text and not green text because the ID would take priority. Does that make sense to you guys? Also, if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Okay, moving on. Oh, also, I don't know if we mentioned this before, but color, it refers to font color and not background color. So make sure you remember that because that was something that threw me off last semester. Okay, selecting multiple elements. So say if you want different classes to have the same elements, you can refer to them in the same line, just separate them with a comma in the CSS file. And once again, you're going to do periods before classes and hashtags before the IDs. So then if you're selecting elements with multiple names, so if you have a class like green big, you would want to refer to that class as period green period big in order to refer to this element, sorry. And then that element would select all elements with both green, dot green and dot big set within its class. And it wouldn't select the big class. Okay, selecting nested elements. This one, you would put a space between selectors. So if you had an ID, if you wanted to only do elements with the class park within the IDJ, you would do hashtag J space dot park. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Actually, do we have any questions on CSS selectors? Okay, cool. Moving on, we have pseudo selectors. So these kind of specify, I like to think of them as like specifying the action behind CSS selectors. That's not entirely true, but that's the way I like to think of them. And they select elements that are under a certain state, and they're really good for user interaction. So as you can see, we have their format is a normal selector and then a colon and the pseudo class. So right here, when we're hovering over this div with our mouse, the font size will be 32 pixels and the color of the font will be green. And it only applies when the cursor is hovering over. Some other pseudo classes include visited and active. And you can click this link after these slides are posted if you want to see some more. And then in summary, okay, so CSS is used to change the default appearance of HTML. It adds like all the details, makes it pretty, basically. It goes in a separate file, usually style.css. That's pretty like standard, especially for this class. In the HTML file, we need this line. When you're first starting, just copy and paste this, as Kelly said. The only thing that would change about this line is the href. It's just the file path, depending on where you put the styles.css within your folder in relation to the index.html file. But usually you can copy and paste and it should be fine. And then CSS looks like this, the HTML element, parentheses, and then properties and values within. Oh, and don't forget your semicolons. Always good. We have our selector summary. Let's see. Sorry, you guys can probably go over this on your own. It's just what we just went over. The pseudo selector summary, just make sure you have the same format. For a lot of there's a lot of different properties out there. If you are looking for a specific property and you don't know what the property is called, you can always look up online. Hey, I want to change the font color, and Google most likely give you the answer. If you want to change how text appears, also you can look on these slides, not just online. This is a list of properties that they're pretty common that we use in this class. For colors, you can always, there's like, every color is linked to a certain ID number. And once again, that's just like playing around with it when you type in colors. It'll pop up. And some more helpful links. Thank you guys. We have, I think, Kathleen next on design.
Okay,
Um,
give me 1 second. Okay, hi. So today we're gonna get more into design. So we like briefly touched it last week. And so today we have like a two-part lecture. So first it's gonna be about what design really is, and then we're gonna go into hierarchy of space. So let's get started. So what even is design? So many of you like probably have a good idea or like a pretty like baseline idea of what design is. And usually it's like, oh, it's like aesthetic design or like things that are pretty. But design is not always just purely aesthetics. Ultimately, design is about problem solving. When you have like a website, for example, you have to figure out, okay, like how am I gonna lay this out so that it actually looks like a nice website and not just like text thrown onto a page, you know? So overall, we have like these 5 layers to design. So on the surface, it's just like visual design. Does it look good? Like where do these items go compared to these items? And then we have our skeleton, which is like the interface and navigation design, as well as the information design. So again, that's like, oh, like where am I going to organize my space so that these items make sense in the spaces that they're in? And then we have structure. So then this is like intuitively, where would I find this information? So for example, in the top left corner, that's usually where we have like our home button to like return back to the main page, for example. Or, oh, usually like the nav bar is on the top or on the side, or it's on some edge of the website, not just like floating in space. And then that also comes along with user experience design, which we'll talk about later. And then we have scope, which features, or no, which uses or encompasses content requirements and feature requirements. And then finally finish off with strategy, which again considers who our users even are. So like if there's a business objective or if there's some strategy that we want to pursue in terms of our design. Sorry, that was a lot of rambling. So we have all of these terms, but we're really only going to focus on these 3. So let's break it down. So first we have user interface or UI, or also the first half of UI UX. And this refers to the space where interactions between humans and machines occur. So that's like when you interact with another, with a website or an app or your phone or some device. Then we have user experience, or the second half of UI UX, where we are referring to a person's emotions and attitudes about using that product. So if I'm using an app that is like taking a year to load, not very good user experience. If I'm using something that's like really hard to navigate, not good user experience. But if it's good to navigate, easy to navigate, good user experience. And then we have human-centered design, or HCD. So HCD is a design approach that incorporates the human perspective or what works best for us. And we'll go more into like these design principles later on in this lecture, where like things are just like kind of intuitive to us. And like that helps us with deciding what we're going to design for. Yeah, so basically, how do these things interact? We have parts of a user, or we have UI, which is like the space between a user and the website. Then we have UX, which is how the person responds to it. And then we have human-centered design, which is like why, or our why or purpose for creating certain decisions in our design process. And so basically, this is just a whole like mix of decision making and yeah, just decision making, where form is meeting function and where decisions meet reality. Yeah. So some of you guys might be like, oh my God, I've never designed before. I don't make aesthetic things. I put like neon yellow text on a black screen sometimes for my presentations, but that's okay. We're here to teach you and we're here to help. Yeah. Oh, wait. Sorry. Okay. Like personally, like I like started doing like design stuff like early in like middle school and high school. And so it's been a lot of just like trial and error where it's like, oh, like I thought that this presentation looked really cool on my like laptop. And then I put it up on the screen and it was like an image of like the Milky Way and then like text over it. And it was like really hard to read. So I was like, oh, I'll just highlight the text in like yellow so that you can really read the black text. But like when you put it up on a screen, it's just like so ugly sometimes, you know? So it's like so much trial and error, you know? And you just have to like keep getting practice in and like not fail necessarily, but like if you make mistakes and you just keep learning from it, then we just progress from there. Yeah. So if you aren't that comfortable with design, that's okay. We're here to help. This is the place to make mistakes. Yeah. So let's move on to what fidelity is. Sorry, that was really random. So when we're creating websites, we like to go from low to mid to high fidelity. And this is basically just creating mockups of a website or some design so that you have like a generic idea of, hey, like this is what my website is eventually going to look like. So with low to mid fidelity, this is when you just put out like placeholders for like where your design elements are going to go. So as you can see here, we have 4 examples of a low or a mid fidelity. I think this is more mid fidelity, where we have boxes that are laying out, hey, this is where our nav bar is. This is where images are going to go. Here's where text is going to go. And then just like laying out the whole page. So like, even though it isn't laid out with like colors or like fonts or like those specifics, you have a general idea of what this website is eventually going to look like. And then we move into high fidelity, which is where color, design choices, and like all that stuff about human-centered design comes in. And then you like have a really nice website on the right. It's like going back to low to / mid fidelity. Low fidelity, I would say, would just be like boxes, like pure boxes of like where those text lines are, like that would just be a box, and you'd like maybe just like write as a note like text box, and not necessarily like line out, oh, like this is 5 lines long. So yeah, just to clear that up. Okay, and then after high fidelity, you can even go as far as making interactive prototypes. So some softwares or like programs can actually support this. I think Figma is one of them, where you can like actually create like a website prototype in Figma, where you can actually like scroll through your design and like interact with it. And so this is like basically like the ultimate fidelity that you can reach. And yeah, and then you're basically like one step away from creating a fully functioning website or app. So let's put everything that we've learned all together. So we have wireframing, and then we have our mockups with our low, mid, and high fidelity mockups, and then we have our HTML and also like CSS with what we just learned. So let's break it down. On the left, we have a wireframe. On the right, we have the fully fleshed out website. And then down here, we have our HTML. So first, we have the whole page. And so that basically refers to the entire HTML that is shown there, plus more, like the page tag that we talked about last week. Then we have this big box that is referring to our big image. And as you can see in the HTML, that's where our image tag is nested. And again, please notice the div tags. Also, take notice in how the image isn't necessarily hitting the complete edge of this div, even though it is only that right now. So like that comes with like padding, margins, and borders, which we will talk about very soon. Okay, next we have the text div. So that's where our price and our title is. And then you'll see in our low fidelity mockup, it's just like a little rectangle. And it doesn't tell us, hey, we have like 2 lines here. It's just a box. And then we have our rating, which is a smaller box in our wireframe. And then you actually can see that it's a rating. And then that is represented in our HTML as well. Are there any questions so far? No? Okay, great. So, cool, wireframing, but how do you make it? So with prototyping, as you can see on the right side, yes, on the right side, we can use Figma, Adobe Sketch, or Adobe Illustrator, Adobe XD or Adobe Illustrator to help us like create these. But ultimately you can also just use pen and paper and just like sketch out your websites. So like later on in the semester, we'll be asking you guys, I think it also might be a homework assignment or a lab assignment to like wireframe very soon. But like you can just like draw it out on a piece of paper and just like try your best to like keep your lines straight. But like that is really nice to like just like draw it out by hand. If you guys have ever like done like a coding project, sometimes it's just like easier to draw things out by hand because you can like physically feel how things are moving and like working together. So yeah, again, this might be a little overwhelming to just like throw all these things at you and expect you to know, oh, this rectangle will look good with this rectangle. But again, everything is just like so trial and error. And we're hopefully going to give you guys enough tools to have a little bit of intuition into how design works. And part of that is also in learning like spatial hierarchy and like text hierarchy and color and like all of that stuff. So hopefully by the end of the semester and like by the time we get to like our midterm project, you guys will feel a little bit more comfortable with design. But yeah, always feel free to ask questions as well. Like never feel like it's a dumb question to be like, does this look okay? And then we'll just like tell you guys what we think. And also design is also like so subjective. Like what one person thinks looks good might not be what another person thinks looks good. So if you think something looks really great and you can justify why you think it looks great, amazing, do that. And then hopefully we'll also be able to see that if we don't already see it at first glance. Yeah? Okay, fantastic. Questions? Okay, moving on. So now on to part 2, which is visual hierarchy, which is also like a very important thing to learn about design if you guys did not already know. So we're going to be covering the importance of space and then macro and micro level spacing. So first of all, importance of space. So let's take a look at some example websites. Ah, beautiful. Just take it in, the magnificence. Okay, does anyone see anything particularly wrong with this? Please. Yeah, how so? Yeah, too many images, too many colors. Yeah, it's a lot. It's really overwhelming, huh? Yeah, okay. Next. Yeah, I don't even know what this is, to be completely honest. There's too many screens. Yeah, it's a lot. So like I think like both of these have a pretty similar problem to each other, which is that they're too cluttered. And so like I guess that's like the general term we'll be using to refer to like too much stuff and like the lack of space. So why is this bad? Does anyone want to answer why they think cluttering is bad? No, no one wants to. Okay, I'll answer myself. Basically, when you have too much stuff on your page, there's just like no idea of where to look. There's like so much content that there's basically no content. It just like negates itself because there's like too much to look at. And you don't really have an idea of what is important on this page. So like this loss of visual hierarchy is like way too much. Like, for example, if we like try to look at this, you have a general idea that this is probably like a video game, right? But like, what is it showing you? I don't really know. I think it would take a long time to figure it out. And so that's why we don't want cluttering on our page. And that's why quality is greater than quantity sometimes. So user attention is a really precious resource. Time is a really precious resource. Personally, I have a difficult time like paying attention for like long periods of time. And that often refers to like websites. Like I look at a website and if I have to scroll too long, then like I'm not going to look at it anymore. Or if it's like too hard to like figure out where I'm supposed to end up, I won't look at it. And so that's why we really need to pay attention to hierarchy and spacing. So using space intentionally helps us establish hierarchy of information in our websites. And so let's talk about what that even is. So for a little bit of terminology, you guys might have heard of positive and negative space before. If not, no worries. So positive space is just like where your information actually is located. And we'll look at an example right after this. And then negative space is like your white space or just your blank space, where it is usually placed between positive, it has to be placed between positive space. And then it like helps you understand where the positive space is and where the information is ultimately. So referring to like space, positive and negative space is not always just like about websites or apps. It can also be referred to in the real world. And so here is an example of the Apple Store. And you can see that the Apple Store has like positive space here in like the rows of tables, and then in like this little area of seats, and then it also has negative space in like the rows of like that you can walk up and down so that you can like see all their products. And so like this is definitely intentional. If like all of these tables just like randomly placed, like that'd be really hard to like walk through and like be like just annoying to walk through. And so that is always just something to think about, like when you like walk around campus or something, you can be like, oh wow, that's positive space and that's negative space. Yeah. And so here is an example of Google here is an example of positive and negative space using Google, which you guys have all probably seen. And so at the bottom, we have our negative space, like this is all just empty. And then we have our positive space where we are using the browser. And so like the negative space helps us define where the positive space is. For example, if this whole screen was the browser, like that'd be like, wow, like really big. And then we like would just be a little overwhelmed by like the sheer like size of the Google logo, you know? So with white space and with positive and negative space, spacing helps us determine emphasis. And so like, again, if we just have one thing like in one like big space, that's pretty important, right? It needs all that space to like breathe. But if you have like a lot of like rows of like stuff or just like text, that is like less important, right? So like when you're looking at an article, for example, at the top, if you have like one big title and it just has like a bunch of space around it, you know that's the title. But then once you get into the article itself, it's like thinner text, and then sometimes you'll have like a block quote, and like that's a little bigger and it has a little bit of space around it. So you know it's a quote, you know it's important, so you look at it. Yeah. So this is also kind of why teachers sometimes ask you guys to like do your like essays in 2-point font or 2-point spacing, or yeah. So it just makes it so much easier to read. If you have it so dense, you can't read it as well. I don't know if you've like done SATs before or like SAT reading sections where it's like so dense that like sometimes I'm like reading it and I accidentally skip like 3 lines. I'm like, oh shoot, and I go back. So it's like really hard to keep your attention like that. And it's also a lot harder to read. Okay, moving on to macro and micro level spacing. So macro level spacing is the space between your core elements of the page. And so this is like creating structure in your breathing room. So again, if you have like a left side of a page or a right side, left side of a page or a right side of a page, those are like macro level spacings because they're like bigger sections, but like within those sections you have smaller things, and so the spacing between those smaller things in those sections would be micro level spacing. And so macro level spacing helps us create structure, and micro level spacing helps us create legibility and like just like a nicer experience for us. So here is an example from Stripe. This is a really pretty website in my opinion. So our macro level spacing is present in like the body of like text with like the header, and then the separation or the negative space between like the edges of the website and your screen. Then our micro level spacing is like the individual spaces between the text and like the other elements. So the spacing between the header and the nav bar, or the header from the subtext or the subtext from this button. So that is all considered micro level spacing. Any questions on that? No? Okay, fantastic. So now onto padding and margins. So honestly, this is like was really confusing to me when I took this class because I was low-key like, aren't they kind of the same thing? And then when you get to your projects or your homeworks, then you get to like figure it out a little bit more where you like can visually see what things are changing when you add padding or margins. But to just set the baseline right now, padding is the spacing within the border of an element. So like, as you can see here, padding would be the spacing between submit and like the border around it. So if we change around like padding to be like 2 pixels or 2 pixels to like 500 pixels, that submit button would have like a massive ring around it. And then margins would be spacing between elements. And so like that comes back to the div tag, where you can like add margins to that specific div that your elements are nested inside of, and then those elements would receive that margin between them. So it's like a little difficult. But yeah, trial and error, guys. So here is a little bit of a better visual for CSS box models. So in the middle, we have our 40 by 40. That is not a square, but we have that in the middle. And then padding is within that element. And then margin is on the outside. Don't really worry about border right now. Okay, for line width, so again, as we mentioned before, when you have really dense text, it's really hard to read. But the same thing that comes with that is width. So if you guys have watched or read articles by like New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and like you notice that the text doesn't reach like the entire outside of the page, that's because it's narrower. So like when we're reading from left to right, like we don't have to scan the entire page. We only just have to scan that paragraph in front of us, if that makes sense. And so again, comes back to the div tag. We can use the div tag to restrict the width of that text. So here's an example from a Medium article, and you'll see it doesn't go all the way to the ends, but this does. And it's kind of ugly, right? Like you have to like read all the way left to right, and like it's a little too much. But when it's closer together, it feels a little cleaner. There's like borders around it. Again, like the negative space is helping us concentrate on that information. And then it's just so much nicer to look at. So far, it kind of seems like I'm just telling you to make a very minimalistic like website where there's a lot of white space and there's a lot of space for your eyes to rest, which is good. Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should have a barren website. So here is a really old 2015 61B website. And if you look at it, there's just like no hierarchy. Like general course information is the same importance as downloading. I guess downloading Java is pretty important, but like I'm not going to be downloading Java every time I look at the website, you know? So even though you should be using spacing, you shouldn't be like overusing it, you know? So barren is the overuse of space, and this can just like kind of like confuse you about like the relationship between elements, if that makes sense. So here's a closer look. Yeah. There's also just like no order to what is on this website either. It's just kind of confusing to look at. So yeah, we want order, and this isn't a barren website because there is order to it. There is like hierarchy and just looks so much nicer. So we want to avoid the barren, and we want to be more intentional using rhythm, symmetry or asymmetry, and then Gestalt principles. So let's break it down. Rhythmic structure is when you have a structure that kind of like has like a pattern to it. And so if we look at the Stripe website again, you'll see that there kind of is a rhythm to it where there's space and then there's content and then there's space and then there's content. And so that kind of is giving us like kind of an expectation of what to expect as we keep scrolling. And so space and content work together to help us define this pattern. Next, we have symmetry and asymmetry. So symmetry helps us create balance. with those repeating patterns that we talked about with rhythm. And then it helps us kind of like work with macro and micro spacing. So you'll see here in the Figma page that we have rhythm and with like the Instagram layout with like the boxes. So we know that if we keep scrolling until the bottom, we're just going to keep seeing squares, right? And so with micro spacing, we know that, hey, like if there's a border, that is a separate page, separate post, sorry. And then with symmetry, it helps us like expect a not 3 by 3, but like a 3 posts per row. And like, we're not all of a sudden going to see 4 posts in one row. If that makes sense. Kind of, yeah, okay. Then we have asymmetry, which helps us create emphasis on different elements. So here in the weight shift website, you'll see that Adobe is like the greatest thumbnail here. But then these ones are a little smaller. And so that helps us understand that maybe this thumbnail is more important, or should be like the first thing that we look at, before we look at like Twitter or these other websites here. Does that also make sense? Yeah, okay. Then we have Gestalt principles. I think we cover these a little deeper later, but just to like give you like a brief rundown, these are only 7 out of 12 Gestalt principles. So like you guys can search those up later or read about those later. But closure is basically the idea that when you have elements inside of a closed space, that those are related to each other. Oh yeah, Gestalt principles are basically like how our brain knows that things are related to each other. And so these are all things or ideas that help us understand that. So closure, closed space, related to each other. Common fate is like if they're moving in the same direction, then they're related to each other. So you'll see here on the E that the shadow of it is moving like backwards. But since it's like kind of progressing towards the same direction, those are all related to each other. Then with continuation, you'll see that if they're like the same shape in a specific pattern, those are related to each other. So like all those circles in that S are related to each other because they're close in space, and then they're also moving in a continuous pattern. Then similarity, so you'll see with the 2 T's in Gestalt, that they look similar, so they should probably be grouped together. Then we have figure ground, which is kind of like, this one's like kind of difficult to explain. Like, it's like, if it has the shape of something familiar, I think, then they're related to each other. I don't know. I could fact check that. But moving on, proximity is like the idea that if they're all really close to each other, then they're related. So this is kind of back to the Instagram post or the Instagram page where the 3 rows or the 3 post row is related to each other and like all the way down since they're like grouped together and close in proximity. Then symmetry is also a Gestalt principle where like if things are symmetric, they're probably related to each other. Yeah, sorry, that was a lot of information all at once. Any questions? Aside from figure ground, I will figure that out. Yeah. Closure is like, so you see like how there are like these little brackets around the G. So like since they're closed in together, then they're probably related. But I think like they kind of work in tandem where like, yes, they could be close together, but like if they're like really far apart, then it's like a little confusing. But like, for example, if there's like 2 circles on the far corners of that box, they're still grouped together. So like they're probably related somehow. But proximity is more so just like pure proximity where it's like really close to each other. So then they're related, not necessarily closed in. Any other questions? No? Okay. So just some things to note as we end the lecture pretty early. We'll be posting cheat sheets for these general topics. So these are mostly going to be for the coding part of like this course because a lot of it is just like referring back to like tags that you have to use or like specific syntax. So just check for Ed when we release those, and then we'll probably post an announcement for that. And then if you're like interested in like visual hierarchy, please feel free to just like continue like looking online about these things. There's a lot of really cool videos online about the principles that I've watched before and they're really fun. And yeah, oh yeah, there's like this article that's hyperlinked in the slides if you guys want to look at that as well. And it's about motion. So like animations and stuff like that can also help us with understanding visual hierarchy or relationships within elements. And we'll learn about animations later on in the course. Also, please have a Figma account. So it's pretty easy to download, I think. You just like go into Figma and use your student email because we get free Figma as Berkeley students. Yay. So have that before next lab. Yeah, I think next lab, probably, not Thursday, next Monday. Please have that. And then I think we're going to be doing a Figma demo. If not, I will also put that in the announcement. I will check that though. Yeah. Okay, any questions? No? Okay. Here is the attendance form. Wait. I don't know if that's right. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. It is? Oh. There. Okay, one more reminder to please send us your GitHub submission link. If you don't, you will not be graded and then you'll probably just like not receive a grade. Also, like if you send it to us like in a month or something, we're gonna have to like go back and grade all of your assignments. And then because you send it like really late, we might grade a little harder. Or we just might not grade it at all. So please send us the submission link. We're missing a lot of them right now. But yes, thank you. That is the end of lecture.
And also, if you have any like setup like questions or bugs, you can come up to us and ask either during office hours or come to lab next week. And for office hours, remember to like email your the person 24 hours ahead of time so they know to be there.
Office hours are on Ed. We put all of our emails there. Sorry those weren't there earlier. But please email us, or else we might not necessarily have the like Zoom open for you guys. Yeah. Oh. Secret word. David. David. We have two.